Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Alvin Karpis, the quiet mastermind whose intelligence and patience made him one of the most calculated figures of America's outlaw era. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in, and let the story of Alvin Karpis guide you into the night. He entered the world in 1907, in Montreal, born to immigrant parents who were trying to find a firm footing in North America. Work pulled the family south and west into the American heartland, where a boy could vanish into a crowd, and a hard winter felt like it might go on forever. School came and went. He learned to watch people before he learned to trust them. The streets taught lessons he kept for life: patience, silence, and the usefulness of planning. Prohibition had turned small. Time hustles into a bigger business. Rum runners, car thieves, gamblers, and stick-up crews blended into neighborhoods where cash moved quietly. Young Alvin slid toward that world with little ceremony. He carried packages, passed messages, and picked up extra money running errands for men who liked to keep their names out of newspapers. The petty jobs nudged him toward real trouble. He drifted into car theft and simple burglary, picking targets that seemed easy. Arrest followed. The Kansas State Industrial Reformatory took him in while he was still a teenager. Behind a wall and a routine, he got a different education. Time inside didn't soften him, it sharpened him. He learned to focus on schedules, guard habits, and the way loose talk draws heat. He paid attention to older inmates who had moved beyond petty jobs, men who broke down plans into parts and never moved without a fallback. He listened more than he spoke, and he remembered everything. Another stretch in a tougher institution brought another turning point. He met Fred Barker, one of the Barker brothers out of Oklahoma, whose family had been in and out of lockups enough to be known across the region. Karpis and Fred clicked. Fred had a fierce streak. Alvin had patience. That mix created a partnership. After release, they found each other again on the outside and began to pull together a crew. Arthur, Doc Barker joined in. Their mother, Kate, later labeled Ma Barker, by headlines that weren't always careful with the truth, stayed close to her sons. She kept house, cooked meals, and floated through apartments and rented homes where the gang laid low. The press later cast her as a mastermind, something Karpis denied for years. He painted her as a presence, not a planner. The early jobs were robberies that favored speed over bravado. They stole cars, swapped license plates, and drove long, crooked routes to confuse anyone who might be following. A smooth getaway mattered more than a flashy entrance. They targeted banks in towns where the alarm system might be old and the police force small. The money pulled them across several states. The Midwest in those years held plenty of places to hide: boarding houses with curtained windows, farmhouses with quiet owners, cabins by lakes in Minnesota, and cheap hotel rooms near railroad yards, where night noises covered whispers and last-minute plans. The crew learned to keep their heads down in cities that looked the other way, especially Street, Paul, where long-standing deals between criminals and local fixers allowed out-of-towners to rest safely as long as they didn't cause trouble on that side of the city limits. Those arrangements helped every famous outlaw of the period. Karpis took advantage of the same shadowy hospitality. He didn't drink much. He didn't blow cash in noisy clubs. He preferred maps, timetables, and steady preparation. That made him different from some of the freewheeling names that filled front pages. When a job happened, he stayed cool, kept people in their roles, and focused on what came after. The crew's robberies grew bolder through 1,931 and 1,932. Tellers and bank managers faced guns, money went into sacks, engines revved at the curb, and stolen Fords or Buicks rolled away fast, often toward another state. These were crimes with victims, fear stamped on faces, and days disrupted for people who had done nothing wrong. The gang knew the risk if anyone resisted. Violence hung in the air every time. Even when nobody fired, the tension left marks. It didn't always go clean. During a payroll robbery near Street Paul in 1933, officers responded quickly. Gunfire followed. One policeman lost his life, and another was badly wounded. The names later filled reports and obituaries, and families carried grief that never left. Karpis would claim in later years that he aimed to avoid bloodshed, yet the truth remains. The gang walked into situations that sparked it. That payroll job hardened law enforcement resolve and drew far more attention than any quiet bank job ever had. Minnesota newspapers turned up the volume. Agents and local detectives compared notes across state lines more often. The landscape shifted under the crew's feet. Pressure created new tactics. The crew shifted from quick hits to kidnappings, a method other outfits had used with alarming success in the early 1930 seconds. Targets were chosen not for fame but for their access to cash, and the likelihood that their families would pay fast to get them back. Street Paul's moneyed class included brewers and bankers whose names were tied to businesses that kept entire neighborhoods working. In June 1933, brewery heir William Ham Jr. was grabbed off a street in Street Paul. The kidnapping did not involve a dramatic assault. It was efficient and timed to minimize public witnesses. He was held for several days while messages moved between the kidnappers and the Ham family. Ransom changed hands, and Ham was released alive. The gang had avoided needless cruelty, yet the act itself was a jarring escalation. A line had been crossed from robbery into kidnapping for ransom, a federal offense that carried enormous consequences. Bank jobs stirred local police. Kidnappings woke up Washington. The money from the Ham case didn't quiet the waters. It did the opposite. Federal agents tracked communications and marked ransom bills. Reporters pressed officials for progress. Criminals had always used Street Paul as a resting place, but now the city's reputation drew national scrutiny. The safety net-friendly landlords, lookouts, and paid-off intermediaries began to fray. Still, the gang pressed on. A bigger ransom tempted them in early 1934, when they targeted Edward Bremer, a banker with significant connections. Bremer was seized on his morning drive. Again, the hostage was treated with enough basic care to ensure he could return home. Negotiations stretched over weeks. The ransom, larger this time, eventually moved through drop points. Bremer went free. The gang carried cash, yet every step had left traces. Serial numbers on bills told a story while they circulated. The kidnappings brought a floodlight. J. Edgar Hoover, eager to prove the growing federal bureau could handle high-profile cases, threw resources behind catching the people responsible. The bureau's legal powers had expanded after bloody failures elsewhere in 1933, and agents now carried firearms and the authority to chase criminals across state lines. The Barker Karpis crew saw the change coming. Apartments were abandoned at night, cars swapped again and again, and new safe houses rented under fresh names. Partners sometimes peeled off. Others drifted in. Karpis, more private than most, tried to cut down on visible patterns. He stuck with his habit of careful planning, avoided alcohol-fueled mistakes, and kept watch on the people around him. Mistakes still happened. A rumor carried by a careless associate could destroy the best-laid plan. Even within the crew, different temperaments created friction. Fred's fire, Doc's stubbornness, and the presence of people outside the core drivers, gunmen, and go-betweens meant secrets multiplied. Karpis took on a larger leadership role as pressure increased, not out of hunger for fame but because his patience kept people out of obvious traps. The group moved through Chicago, Kansas City, Oklahoma, and back to Minnesota, a circular path shaped by money and pursuit. Stolen mail, bank vaults opened under duress, payroll sacks snatched from couriers, each crime widened the circle of investigators looking for them. Every quiet sunrise in a hideout felt like borrowed time. He also cultivated relationships in the underworld that might provide specialized help. A doctor with a shady past treated wounds and, in some cases, performed procedures criminals believed would reduce recognition by police. These operations were crude and risky. Karpis pursued such services to shake off identification from photos and old acquaintances. That choice marked another line crossed in service of escape. He valued survival and freedom more than comfort. If a painful procedure might slow identification, he would endure it. The same cold logic pushed him to cut ties with people he believed might talk. Hard choices and hard faces surrounded him. Despite the growing heat, he kept his voice low and his routines constant. He rarely boasted. Headlines did the boasting for him, branding him with a nickname that stuck. Creepy. A word linked to his thin smile and unblinking stare in photographs. He disliked the label. It made him seem like a caricature, while he saw himself as a planner who avoided chaos. Yet the nickname traveled faster than facts. Posters carried it. Agents used it. It echoed in taverns where folks traded stories about outlaws the way they traded box scores. By 1934, one thing was certain. He had become one of the most hunted men in the country. All of this flowed from a chain of choices that began in a modest family apartment and moved through reform schools and prisons, out into a country battered by hard times. Each time he went through a barred door, he learned something he thought would keep him free the next time. Each lesson made him better at staying out of sight and more dangerous to the communities he passed through. He could be polite to strangers and patient with slow talkers. Yet when money or freedom lay on one side of a door and risk on the other, he didn't hesitate. People got hurt. Some never came home. That truth frames his story more than any nickname. By the middle of the decade, cracks showed everywhere in the network that had supported him. Street Paul's old arrangements collapsed under national criticism. Local protectors lost their positions. Informants appeared where old friends had stood. The kidnapping ransoms still traced back to the crew even when bills moved far from Minnesota. One member after another fell. Arrests in Chicago, raids in Florida, and traffic stops in small towns kept pressure on every safe house he might consider. The loss of comrades stiffened his resolve but also cut resources. With every capture, new details leaked into files and filled briefing rooms in Washington. He had built a life around movement, caution, and calculation. Now the circle's closed, slower than a gunshot but just as final. He could sense it in the way landlords studied him a second longer, in the way a stranger's eyes lingered on a newspaper photo, in the change of tone when a telephone operator repeated his room number. He understood that this was the cost of a path chosen years earlier. He kept his suitcase packed, counted cash carefully, and tried to stay one turn ahead of men who never stopped looking. The quiet man with the steady voice, the planner who favored patience over noise, had become the focus of a national search that would not let up. The bright glare of publicity that followed the Ham and Bremer cases pushed him into a different kind of life. Before, he could fade into a boarding house, cook supper with a few friends, keep watch with curtains barely open, and drift out before dawn. After those kidnappings, faces turned toward him from every cafe counter, baggage clerk, and gas pump. Street Paul's old handshake arrangements crumbled under national anger. The city's promise of "no heat if you behave" dissolved. Officials faced questions they couldn't dodge. Friendly intermediaries lost their jobs. A safe harbor vanished in a rush of headlines and fired police chiefs. He adjusted the way he always had, by studying routines, cutting ties that felt loose, and choosing quiet apartments where neighbors minded their own business. Bigger crews break under that kind of pressure. The circle around him shrank to people who accepted rules without argument. No parties. No loud gramophones. No cars left too long in one spot. If a building manager looked twice at a new tenant, the room was abandoned. He didn't pretend the money from ransom could erase the risk. Those bills were marked. Clerks took note of serial numbers. A single careless purchase could yank a thread that led straight to a door at midnight. Rumors traveled fast in that era. A barber in Street Paul could tell a train conductor in Chicago, who might mention a tidbit to a yard worker in Kansas City, and by the weekend somebody in Oklahoma would swear he'd seen the man whose photo rode posters. Some of those stories were wrong, yet a few landed close enough to draw trouble. He learned to shave off habits that made him easy to follow. The same steady demeanor that comforted crews in a heist now kept tension down in rented flats, where everyone listened for the knock that ended everything. Across the Midwest, bank work had changed. Silent alarms were newer. Vaults updated schedules. Guard posts shifted. Patrol cars answered. Calls faster. The list of towns willing to turn a blind eye was shorter every month. Robberies brought uncertain money with high risk. That pushed him toward jobs that required more planning and fewer moving parts. Arranging stolen cars through trusted hands. Securing papers under assumed names. Setting up mail drops. He still took part in conventional robberies when opportunity matched his standards, but he trimmed exposure at every step. Even then, no one in the path of a robbery forgot the sight of weapons or the fear that came with them. He never tried to argue that away in later years. He said he thought about minimizing harm, but he went through with acts that put lives in danger. Street Paul's fall from a staying place into a target zone changed the balance of power. A long-serving officer who had once played fixer lost his title and any shield he might have offered. Friends of the old system faced hearings. That meant files opened. Names that had floated only in whispers became lines on paper. He could feel the ground tilt. The crew's kidnapping choices had upset families with reach far beyond Minnesota. One of those families had close ties in Washington, which meant the Bureau had every reason to chase harder than ever. Agents didn't just wait near banks or highways now. They watched apartments, hotels, and stores where marked bills might appear. They tested new techniques to lift fingerprints from paper and glass and mapped the gang's habits. It became a chess game with too many eyes on the board. His response showed his character. He didn't try to buy headlines. He didn't drive brand new cars through main streets or wave at photographers the way other outlaws sometimes did. He tightened discipline. He sought a physician with a shadowed practice who boasted about altering features so recognition wouldn't come so easily. The work was crude, painful, and hardly the miracle that clients hoped for. But he still put himself through procedures to blur lines around scars and soften a nose shape that had become familiar. Cuts healed. Bruises faded. He knew that the real defense lay in behavior, not bandages, but he took what he could get. Whispered stories later claimed that the same surgeon disappeared not long after, a reminder of how people on the edges paid for their choices in strange, quiet ways. He also crossed paths with underworld couples who lived by their own codes, older hands who had been pulling backroom deals and hiding wounded fugitives before the papers learned to print the names in the right order. A pair out of the Chicago area offered a couch, a meal, and messages carried carefully by people who never looked like couriers. In one later account, he described seeing a badly hurt outlaw being nursed in a back room after a disastrous escape in Wisconsin, a scene that pulled together strands from the wider world of Depression-era crime. Whether every detail matched perfectly or not, the atmosphere felt right. Blinds down at noon, damp towels to keep fever down, whispered arguments about whether to move before sunset, the heavy knowledge that each visitor increased the danger for everyone in the house. That world operated on favors, debts, and a kind of brittle loyalty that cracked under heat. The year after the Bremer kidnapping brought a firestorm. In early 1935, one of his closest partners, Arthur "Doc" Barker, was caught near Chicago. Arrest didn't just take a man off the team. It opened doors the crew had believed were locked. Papers in Doc's belongings, snippets from conversations, and simply the pressure of agents asking the same questions from dawn to dusk pushed the net wider. Within days, federal officers tracked a Lake Weir cottage in Ocklawaha, Florida, where Fred Barker and his mother, Kate, had rented under a gentle alias. The Bureau surrounded the place before sunrise. What followed lasted for hours. Orders shouted, shots into walls, replies from inside. A standoff that ended only when the silence inside stretched too long. Fred was dead. Kate was dead. The bodies were removed past a crowd held back by ropes. People in that town still talked about that day decades later. The Bureau framed the outcome as the defeat of a mastermind. He, in later years, called that claim nonsense. He said Kate kept a mother's watch over her sons, cooked meals, and enjoyed a warm kitchen but did not plan crimes. Regardless of the arguments, the loss altered his life. 2 anchors of the original crew were gone within 10 days, one to handcuffs, one to gunfire. The path ahead narrowed. His reaction to that wave of arrests and death was to go colder. He changed names, cars, and cities more often. Contacts he had trusted for years were now liabilities. He functioned with a tiny circle and preferred to arrange meetings in public places where entrances and exits could be scanned quickly. The money from the big kidnappings only made that harder. Every bill with a recorded number was a trap waiting to spring. He had once enjoyed a network that stretched from Minnesota to Oklahoma. Now he moved like a solitary figure, wary of even slight coincidences around him, suspicious of the way a hotel clerk angled a ledger or the sudden friendliness of a stranger on a stoop. He worked with men whose specialties fit his needs. One knew how to get clean titles for cars. Another could find apartments under fresh names without asking clumsy questions. A third could quietly arrange storage for trunks and boxes so that quick moves didn't require dragging everything from room to room. These were the unglamorous tasks that kept him free longer than most, a practical approach that contrasted with the showmanship of others. He preferred daylight searches for apartments over midnight scurrying, trusted regular routines more than frantic leaps, and held to the idea that the best disguise was acting exactly like the neighbor no one remembers. Law enforcement kept closing the gap. A public designation arrived in 1936. He was named the Bureau's top target, public enemy number one. That phrase carried a strange kind of fame that he didn't welcome. It made him into a symbol. Businesses sold newspapers with his nickname across the top. Theater lobbies showed newsreels about the rise and fall of gunmen, and his face appeared among them. He had worked hard to avoid profile. Now the country knew his eyes from handbills tacked up in post offices. With that label came more agents on trains and buses, more stops for cars carrying out-of-state plates, more bad nights when a knock on the wrong door sent him downstairs in stocking feet, coat under his arm. He considered a different kind of job altogether, a big haul that would send him offshore with enough cash to live quietly under warmer skies. Stories later described him studying a high-value mail shipment, plotting timing and routes with characteristic patience, and even looking into a boat he could take beyond easy reach of the Bureau. He believed that one last operation, done right, could end the chase. That faith in planning had kept him going since his reform school days, and he leaned on it again. He scouted, counted minutes between station stops, studied roadblocks in previous cases, and weighed who he could trust for a job that would demand perfect timing. During these months, he avoided alcohol, cheap gossip, and anyone who craved spotlight. He woke early, read papers cover to cover, and kept files on agents he had learned to recognize. He knew names by then, men who had followed him from city to city. He changed appearance enough to pass glances, but he couldn't change his height or the way he moved. He tried to carry himself like a traveling salesman, a quiet clerk, a man whose suitcase held samples and order forms rather than maps and money. He kept rooms neat, paid rent on time, and tipped just enough to appear generous but not memorable. He never stayed long enough to grow roots. Friends peeled away for separate reasons. Some were arrested and faced long sentences they couldn't shake. Others fled to different cities under new names, fearful that any link to him would ruin them. A few disappeared into the blank spaces of the time bodies found in thickets. Names mumbled in back rooms, debts settled without police. That was the world he inhabited. Brief alliances, cold calculations, a stopwatch always running in the background. He liked chess because it allowed emotional distance. It fit his way of seeing people as pieces on a board that could be used or sacrificed. The Bureau followed different lines. Agents had learned from earlier stumbles. They quietly placed informants in the underworld circles, where he still had to travel for papers and cars. They watched girlfriends, cousins, tailors, even doctors. A single conversation in a cafe could lead to a car's plate number written on a napkin, which could lead to a hotel registry, which might give a room number. He knew that, yet he had to move. Money didn't carry itself. Plans didn't make themselves. Each errand carried risk. The quiet brutality of his path shows in the wake he left behind. Staff in banks who jumped at noises long after a robbery. Lawmen's families who set an extra plate at holiday tables for someone who never came home. Small-time helpers who went to prison for one poor choice tied to his orbit. He later tried to say that he never aimed to kill. That may have been true in intent, but he operated in an arena that kept placing danger on top of danger. Early in his run, a police officer died during a payroll grab near the stockyard south of Street Paul. Other bullets found targets elsewhere. Those names deserve remembrance. The absence sat like a stone in the story and testified to the reality beneath the headlines. After the Florida shootout that ended Fred's life and took Kate's, he felt the chase shift again. The Bureau, emboldened and better armed, moved faster and with more authority. They would no longer accept long sieges ending in escapes. They built cases across state lines and filed federal charges that cut through local red tape. He responded by putting even more miles under his tires, reaching Gulf Coast cities where old acquaintances worked in shipping or on the river. The ports offered a constant flow of strangers, the kind of crowd where a steady man could disappear as long as he remained calm. He spent time in places where streetcars rattled, fishermen mended nets along canals, and summer heat pressed down at noon. He used aliases that sounded unremarkable. He scheduled meetings outdoors near markets, where conversations sank into the hum of vendors and trolley bells. Along the coast, he thought the big plan might finally happen, that he could step away with stolen mail money enough to start a life far from the continent that kept whispering his name through radio sets. He was tired of running, but he could not admit that to anyone, not even himself. The only language he trusted was arrangement. Pick a day, place, and time. Then drill every step. In those last months before his capture, he showed both the strength and the flaw of his method. He was meticulous, yet the very repetition of caution created patterns. A preferred type of apartment, a habit of paying in small bills, a taste for certain markets, these left faint fingerprints that smarter investigators began to see. Somewhere in the weave of conversations, an informant tipped the Bureau to his presence in a city known more for music and river trade than for the bank headlines that had trailed him north. The circle closed invisibly at first. Agents rented rooms nearby, studied license plates, and moved without the fanfare that had tripped them up in earlier years. He felt the air change a little. An extra glance here, a car that seemed to pass twice, but he had outrun so many traps that he believed he could sidestep one more. He still thought in terms of schedules, not destinies. If a meeting looked wrong, he would void it. If a contact showed nerves, he would cut them loose. He trusted shuffle and delay as tools that had saved him countless times. Yet the Bureau had patience too now. They could wait in hallways, lean on fenders, and let him relax into a routine he had adjusted a dozen times before. He never claimed to be fearless. He admitted in later years that he had felt a weight on his chest often during those days. A quiet dread that did not keep him from acting but made sleep shallow and meals taste thin. Somewhere inside, he knew that he had run out of luck more than once, and had been granted a reprieve by randomness. He counted on control to make up the difference. Control would fail him soon. Through everything, he kept writing small notes to himself, not about poetry or philosophy, but about routes that avoided patrols, markets with short lines, bridges that stayed open during repairs, hotels with side stairwells, voices that carried gossip to places he didn't want his name to land. He was not a charismatic roarer. He was a list maker. That had made him the gang's planner, the steady hand in chaos. Now, with partners arrested or dead, those lists served only him. He had become a solitary man in rented rooms, careful with his money, and quieter with each passing week. He didn't believe in redemption speeches. He believed in one more day of freedom, earned by organization. That belief kept him moving right up until the knock that no notebook could prevent. He woke before the streetcars sang, stepping into a morning that smelled of coffee and river mud. New Orleans hid him for a short while, a place noisy enough to swallow footsteps and crowded enough to let a quiet man blend with clerks, porters, and dockhands. He still trusted early hours more than midnight. Fewer eyes, fewer loose conversations. He checked a mirror, adjusted a cap, and carried the same steady manner that had guided him through tense years. He did not know that agents had taken rooms nearby, that they had traced him through whispers and small mistakes, and that they had learned to wait. The move came without shots. Cars idled along the curb on Canal Street. Doors opened, and men stepped in close. Hands firm, voices flat. He had a weapon in the car, they later said, but it never cleared a seat. A famous director of the Bureau stood near, keen to show the country that the long hunt had ended. Accounts diverge about what happened in that instant. Some swore the director himself grabbed a wrist. Others, including the man at the center, said he kept his distance and watched agents do their job. The strangest detail that traveled from mouth to mouth was simple. The agents had rushed so hard they had to secure him with a tie because they were short a pair of cuffs. True or not, the anecdote fit the mood of the era publicity. Heavy, practical work, still done by whoever stood closest. What mattered most was plain. He was in custody, uninjured, surrounded, the runover. Headlines reached everywhere by afternoon. Newsboys called his nickname. Photos showed a thin face, a direct stare, a hat pulled low. The Bureau's chief took a bow in the papers, promising that the worst of the Depression's roaming gangs had now been crushed. For years, agents had taken criticism after famous showdowns. Now they moved with confidence, backed by laws that allowed them to chase across state lines. The label, Public enemy number one landed, and with it the sense that a chapter was closing. He did not argue with the cuffs. He kept his breathing steady and said little. Back in Minnesota, indictments waited. Kidnapping carried the heaviest weight. The Ham case and the Bremer case had pulled government attention at every level. Families had paid dearly for safe returns, and the numbers on those ransom bills had floated through stores long after the hostages walked free. He faced counts that could keep him in a cell for the rest of his life. Advisors told him that juries would treat him as a symbol, not only a defendant. He chose not to mount a grandstand defense. He entered pleas that avoided a spectacle and accepted the outcome the law prescribed: life behind bars. The decision spared him the death penalty threats that sometimes hovered around such cases, though his victims had come home alive. He denied being cruel for cruelty's sake, but he did not deny the acts. He had robbed banks. He had planned kidnappings. He had led a crew whose jobs left grief behind. After sentencing, a train took him to a federal penitentiary on the plains. Leavenworth hardened men by routine. Wake-ups sounded at dawn. Counts repeated like drumbeats. The hum of 1,000 small tasks, kitchen work, laundry, repair, filled the day. He moved through that system like a man reading a manual, learning rules, noting where trouble started, avoiding empty talk. He had always preferred order over impulse. In a strange way, the prison's strict schedule fit his nature. Guards watched him closely because his name carried a story bigger than one inmate. He kept his head down. He neither begged nor boasted. Within months, orders came for a transfer across the continent. A boat pulled through fog into a harbor that held a gray rock in its center. Alcatraz had a reputation as the place where high-risk inmates disappeared from the public mind. On arrival in 1936, he took a number and a narrow cell. Morning whistles, clanging doors, footsteps, the faint echo of voices in a place designed to prevent conversation. That became the texture of his days. A warden ruled with formal calm. Silence hours were enforced. Work meant kitchen shifts, orderly duty, or time in the shops. The library offered thin escape through magazines and books, scrubbed of anything the censors disliked. He adapted again by leaning into the only control left to him: discipline. Other famous names had landed there too. George Machine Gun Kelly, once splashed across front pages, kept to careful routines and a softer manner that surprised new arrivals. Inmates joked that the machine gun had fallen silent long ago. Robert Stroud, the Birdman, lived cut off from the main line and rarely showed his face. Stories about him carried far beyond anything most men actually saw. He crossed paths with bank robbers, racketeers, car thieves, and men who had made terrible choices that no newspaper would ever chronicle. In that company, celebrity meant little. The Rock reduced everyone to a number and a set of chores. He missed the planning table, the maps, the sense of control he'd once found in arranging every step. To steady himself, he made lists of a different kind. Books to request, exercises to repeat, notes on music scales he wanted to learn. A guard passed him a harmonica after months of good behavior, and from there he taught himself to read simple notation. The instrument fit the place: small, quiet, private. Later, he picked up a guitar through the same slow reward system that marked time for men who kept clean records. Music gave him a task that did not involve deception or flight. He practiced until his fingertips hurt, then practiced more. Even that discipline carried echoes of the life he had lived. Exact, patient, methodical. News from outside still filtered in. He learned that one of the old crew, Arthur Doc Barker, had also been moved to the island after earlier years on the mainland. Doc remained stubborn, the way he had always been. In January 1939, a group of inmates tried to break through to the water in a scheme that counted on fog and luck. Sirens wailed. Orders snapped. Rifle fire cracked across the yard and shoreline. By dawn, it was over. Doc lay among the casualties. The institution tightened. For the man in his cell, the lesson was familiar. Plans fail, timing betrays, and the price is final. He carried that news like a stone in his pocket, heavy and cold. The island had its own crisis years later. In May 1946, a group of inmates seized weapons during a work detail, grabbed hostages, and tried to force a breakout. The attempt unraveled fast and turned into a siege, with the prison ringed by Marines and guards. The rock shook with explosions and bursts of gunfire. In his tier, men lay low, while officers moved from post to post. By the time the smoke cleared, several people were dead, others wounded, and the prison's ironclad image carried fresh scars. He had not joined the uprising. He watched the system respond, and wrote the date in his memory as another reminder that chaos breeds disaster far more often than freedom. He had decades to weigh his own path. In letters allowed under strict rules, he wrote sparingly about daily life and almost never about feelings. He preferred subjects that could be measured. Schedules, results, reading lists. He studied law enough to understand the possibilities and limits of petitions. He filed papers, sought transfers, asked for privileges he felt he'd earned, and accepted denials with the same calm he showed when the street pole cases ended. When he did talk about the outside world, he rarely named names. Aging into middle years behind bars, he knew that many of the people he had once called friends were gone, dispersed, or buried. Time sanded away any urge to pose as a folk hero. He never pretended the kidnappings had been anything but what they were. He never pretended the bank jobs felt noble once the doors clanged shut behind him. He had picked a lane that brought quick cash, constant risk, and a wake of frightened faces. The Bureau had hunted him hard because the public demanded proof that law would not fold before bands of armed thieves. He also understood that his cool head and stubborn habits had kept him free longer than most, and that those same habits had finally failed. He did not write apologies in flowery language. He let the fact of his sentence serve as the measure of the harm done. Even on the island, he kept collecting skills. He took pride in doing jobs right: clean counters, tight seams, repaired tools returned on time. He coached less steady inmates on how to keep a low profile so they might hold a job and earn small trust from officers. He didn't talk about reform much. He talked about tactics for survival in a place where one loud word could wreck a year of good standing. Music remained his best refuge. Scales turned into simple tunes, and simple tunes became a practice that marked hours the way a clock would in a house. In a crosscurrent no one could have predicted, that small talent would later link him briefly to a drifter obsessed with songs, but that meeting lay years ahead in another prison on the coast. Outside, stories about the Barker era kept shifting. Reporters still argued over how much Kate Barker had known, how much she had done. He held to his line. She traveled with her sons, cooked, fussed, and took pleasure in ordinary moments when they appeared. But she did not run the gang. He spoke of Fred with an affection tinged by regret. He spoke of Doc with frankness, admitting that stubbornness and impatience had dragged the crew into risks he tried to avoid. He remembered other names too. A doctor who promised new faces with crude cuts. A couple who patched up men running from disaster in Wisconsin. A parade of drivers and go-betweens who took chances for money and sometimes paid with freedom or life. Those recollections, when he finally wrote them down years later, did not romanticize. They read like reports from a long, cold campaign. He watched the prison change around him. New officers arrived. Older ones retired. Rules eased in small ways and tightened in others. World War II came and went, and men on the island heard about it through radios guarded by staff. The mainland shifted to peacetime prosperity, while the Rock kept churning the same routine. He aged into a careful, courteous inmate, the sort who knew every line on the floor and never stepped over it. The label that had once made him a headline character now mattered mostly as a reason to keep him under a sharper eye. Every so often, rumors floated that he might be moved. The island's costs drew criticism. Politicians weighed whether the prison still served its purpose. He lived in that uncertainty the same way he had lived in danger on the street, by planning one day at a time. He was not free to choose routes anymore. He could choose only how to fill the hours that lay between counts. He wrote down recipes, memorized guitar chords, copied sentences from books so he could feel them settle into memory. The man who had once hidden in crowded rail yards now hid in work and tunes. He did not escape justice through deals or betrayals. He served time, year after year. Other inmates arrived with reputations and left with quiet footsteps, transferred or paroled. He remained. Guards came to see him as steady, not trouble. Younger men asked him about the old days, and he warned them off glamour. Whatever stories the movies told, the truth for him had been much more ordinary. Long planning, short bursts of panic, and costs that never went away. He did not lecture. He let the shape of his life show the answer. In the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, the tide finally turned against the rock itself. The cost of running a fortress on an island rose, and the place needed repairs that would be hard to justify. Plans formed to close it and redistribute inmates to other institutions. After more than 2 decades looking across that same strip of water to the city beyond, he learned he would be sent north to a prison surrounded by pine trees and cold rain, a place where the sound of gulls would be replaced by fairies' horns and the slap of waves in a different channel. He had no say in the move, but he understood the pattern. Institutions change. The life goes on. He packed what little he owned, books, notes, a practiced hand with strings, and prepared to step into another routine under another set of watchful eyes. The path from Canal Street to a steel bunk had taken only days. The path from cell to any hint of relief took decades. In those years, he learned to live without a world that had once revolved around rapid getaways, secret apartments, and high-risk scores. The young man who valued control had been stripped of almost every choice. In that quiet, he found only 2 things he could command: how he carried himself, and what he built hour by hour. He chose restraint. He chose craft. He could not reverse the hurt the gang had caused or restore the lives broken during robberies and kidnappings. He could only keep breathing evenly, keep the routine exact, and let the clock move toward a different chapter that he could not yet see. The boat cut across cold water, and he watched the shoreline roll by in shades of gray and green. After years of concrete and gulls wheeling over a rocky yard, the ferry to a forested prison felt strange. Pines stood along the banks like sentries. Fog lifted and settled again in slow breaths. McNeil Island had a different rhythm from the rock. The place was quieter, less stark, yet still ruled by schedules and keys. He arrived older, his hair thinner, his habits more ingrained. Guards clocked him in, assigned a bed, outlined rules. He nodded, listened, and began to build another routine. He found work that kept his hands busy. Workshops hummed. Men sanded wood, repaired shoes, folded laundry, bound books. He liked jobs that rewarded patience. The old urge to map escape routes had drained away. He focused on skills that made the day pass cleanly. Fixing seams, tightening bolts, keeping ledgers tidy. He stayed polite and steady. Years had taught him how to avoid arguments that led nowhere. He didn't carry himself like a legend. He carried himself like a careful worker who wanted no trouble. Music followed him across the water. He kept a small stack of practice sheets and a battered instrument that had earned him privileges on the island out in the bay. In the new shop, he found time after shift to run scales, then simple songs. Younger inmates drifted closer, curious about how he made a tune out of breath and metal reeds, then out of strings. He showed them finger placement without lecturing. He never offered speeches about morals or fate. He talked about timing, memory, repetition. The things that had once made him an effective planner had become tools for quiet craft. One of the men who orbited him during those years buzzed with restless energy. He was short, sharp-eyed, always angling for attention, forever pitching himself as a future musician. He begged for tips, chords, tricks, any thread that might pull him into the world outside as a singer. The older man obliged in small doses, showing him how to hold a guitar, how to change keys without losing the line, how to keep rhythm with a foot tap instead of letting tempo drift. He later wrote that the youngster wanted fame more than practice, that he could sell a room on a story but stumbled over the hard work of building a song. Years later, when the world learned the younger man's name for a different set of crimes that chilled the country, reporters tried to tie them together with bold lines. The truth was narrower. For a time, in a prison by the water, an aging inmate showed a novice a few chords and warned him that raw hunger without discipline leads nowhere good. Days at McNeil moved by like rain fronts. He woke early, kept a cell neat, checked his calendar, and stuck to routines that left no space for rumor. He requested reading through proper channels and turned pages like a man building a bridge across hours. He helped men draft letters. He showed them how to keep records so small privileges wouldn't slip away over sloppy mistakes. He didn't claim to be reborn. He claimed to be organized. Organization had once powered robberies and kidnappings. Now it powered survival. Every so often, the past found him in the form of a letter or a clippings envelope sent by someone fascinated by the old gangster era. He read about how the country remembered those years: Dillinger at a theater, a shootout in an Oklahoma hideout, fugitives who ran through headlines and died on roadways. He knew which stories had been padded and which had been paired. He avoided interviews. He gave no instructions, offered no tutorials in old tradecraft. He stayed inside the boundaries set for him and saved his words for notes he kept tucked away, lists of events written in a flat tone, as if he were still tallying distances between waypoints on a long trip. Parole came up like a tide he had learned not to expect. Boards changed, laws adjusted, public moods shifted. He applied according to schedule. He gathered work records, support letters, and evidence that he had kept clean. For years he heard the same result: denied. The names tied to the kidnapping still carried weight. Families who had filled ransom bags decades earlier had not forgotten. The label from 1936 still hovered over his file. He didn't explode or brood. He turned back to routine. When a denial letter arrived, he answered it with the only thing he could control: another flawless month. As the 1,960 seconds moved on, the climate altered. The island in the bay closed and turned into a symbol of a former era. The cost of running it had grown too high. Public views on long incarceration began to broaden in certain cases, and his record inside: no stabbings, no rackets, years of steady work and patient conduct, stood in stark contrast to the chaos of his early life. He knew that any release would come with strings so tight they might as well be chains. He would not be going back to American streets as a citizen. He had been born in Canada and never naturalized. If a parole board ever signed his papers, immigration would escort him north as soon as possible. He made peace with that. The United States had been the stage for his worst choices. Maybe distance would make it easier to move through the last chapter. During these same years, researchers and agents reshaped the story of the Barker crew for the record. Court files were copied. Old reports were compared. It became clear how often the gang had benefited from civic corruption in a single city, and how rapidly the arrangement crumbled under national glare. He tracked those developments with a blunt acceptance. He had lived through the collapse from the inside. He knew how a nod at a back door could mean the difference between a quiet night and a raid, but he also knew that those nods came with their own risks, because the person who granted them could be fired, flipped, or exposed. He spoke less as memory stretched away from the fevered days of 1933 and 1934. When younger men asked what a bank job had felt like, he refused theater. He said it had felt like standing too close to a cliff, even when no one fired. He said every noise sounded like an alarm and every breath seemed too loud. He said he could still picture the faces of tellers whose mornings turned into a blur. No glamour, only nerves, and then a sickened quiet when it was over. He acknowledged the payroll job near the stockyards that left a policeman dead, and he gave the loss its due weight, never tossing it off as the cost of doing business. That kind of talk had been common among braggarts he'd known. He kept his language plain and let the long sentence he was serving speak to the scale of the harm done. The younger man with songs grew bolder and then sullen as he realized that no one could hand him talent. He asked for introductions to people outside. The older man shrugged. He was in no position to sponsor anyone. He could only share what he knew about timing and practice. He later wrote that the kid had a salesman's sheen and a knack for drawing followers, traits that might have been harmless in a studio but turned sinister when mixed with bitterness and need. In that observation sits the difference between his own method and the kid's: cold planning versus chaotic manipulation. Neither path led to good ends, but they were not the same. A correctional counselor eventually told him that a parole hearing set for the late 1960 seconds might be his best chance yet. He prepared with the same precision he had once reserved for scouting a route. He collected work evaluations, letters about his conduct, and proof that he had helped others without asking for anything. He showed that he had aged into someone who valued quiet, who understood rules, who had not tried to run a black market, who had avoided quick cash even when he could have taken a cut. He didn't beg. He stated facts. He knew the panel would see the kidnappings at the center of his life and the fear they inspired. He hoped they would also see 3 decades of steadiness inside a system that punished disorder. The hearing did not involve bright lights or theatrical speeches. It involved questions delivered in low voices and answers that charted a path from a Montreal birth to a New Orleans arrest, then from Alcatraz to the Northern Sound. He owned what he had done without the evasions that had once passed for clever. He did not seek pity. He sought a chance to live quietly, under close watch, in a country that had not been his home since childhood. When the board approved parole in 1969, the news traveled through corridors like the faintest current. He packed what little he had. Guards shook his hand the way men do when they respect a person's conduct, even if they don't respect his past. A car took him to a border station. Officials processed paperwork while he sat with a small bag at his feet and a map in his head. The gate opened into cool air. Re-entry did not deliver an embrace. Canada agreed to take him because he had been born there. He was not a hero returning from a voyage. He was a former planner of kidnappings who had spent more than half his life in U.S. prisons. He accepted that and kept moving. He stayed briefly with family, learned bus routes, found a modest room without fanfare, and started learning a world that had sprinted ahead. Radios had become televisions everywhere. Cars had changed shape and speed. Old slang sounded like a postcard from a vanished town. He treated it like any other environment. Observe, adapt, and never bluff knowledge you don't have. He had kept notes for years, terse lists that read like outlines for a report. Now people wanted to hear about the Barker crew and the system that had held him for so long. He chose to write, rather than give taped confessions on cue. On paper he could control tone, and he could show respect for the facts without spinning them into romance. He described reform schools, the street, Paul arrangement, the Ham and Bremer cases, the Florida standoff, the Bureau's evolving methods, the capture, the long tenure on the rock, and the quieting effect of decades of order. He pushed back at the legend that a mother had masterminded a ring of men. He insisted that she had traveled with her sons but had not planned their crimes. He gave credit to the officers who had learned from early blunders and pursued him more capably over time. He kept names straight, timelines clean, and judgments clear. For a man who had survived by maps, writing was a recognizable exercise. Each chapter ran like a route, a start, a series of turns, landmarks, an end. He did not soften the reality that robberies left staff shaken and that a payroll grab had taken a life. He did not pretend kidnappings had been political statements. They had been crimes meant to extract money. He acknowledged that ransoms once paid bought him time, food, rooms, cars, and the false comfort that he could continue to calculate his way out of traps. He admitted that calculation had failed him and that he had been lucky to be taken alive. The outside world often greeted his memoirs with the fascination people reserve for crime tales. He did his best to turn that curiosity into a record rather than a thrill ride. Interviews came with questions about the era's famous names and whether he had felt anything like remorse. He answered that he felt the absence of people whose lives he had collided with, that he could not undo what had been done, and that he found no use in pretending to be a different person now. He said that if anyone took advice from him, it should be about how ordinary and fearful the life of a so-called outlaw had actually been. Early mornings, careful notes, short sleeps, and a lot of waiting for something to go wrong. In Canada, he kept his circle small. He met a few writers, answered questions with the same measured speech he had used to plan escapes from notice, and then went home to cook simple meals and practice music. Freedom had a fragile feel after so long. He recognized that he would always be watched, if not by officers then by neighbors who carried a scrapbook of headlines in their heads. He never chased celebrity. If a city block forgot who he was, he let it. Requests arrived from south of the border to appear on talk shows or to consult on films about the 1,930 seconds. He declined most of them. He did not want to become a character there to draw ratings. He preferred the small room, the quiet walk to a corner grocer, a cup of coffee sipped while watching weather slide in over rooftops. He had been good at finding places to hide when men with badges hunted him. Now he hid in plain sight by being uneventful. Even in this new life, he studied systems. He learned how Canadian agencies handled former inmates from other countries, how to secure identification cards, how to arrange simple work that didn't place him at the center of anything. He took pride in handling tasks without asking for favors. He had once depended on favors from corrupt fixers, contacts with double lives, doctors who cut corners. Now he depended on the regular office hours of clerks who stamped forms and preferred people who never raised their voices. Looking back from a small kitchen table, he could see how every stage of his life connected. A boy who learned to keep quiet grew into a young man who turned silence and patience into tools for crime. A planner who loved control collided with a federal system that learned to plan harder. An older man who had lost friends to bullets and bars surrendered to the routine of prison and found a brittle peace in it. A paroled inmate crossed a border to live modestly and write what he knew, so those who came after could understand the difference between headlines and the long slog of cause and effect. He did not claim that age had canceled anything. The kidnappings remained, stamped into record books, families, and his own memory. The officer killed near the stockyards did not return for any holiday. Bank staff who had stared at weapons during tense minutes carried that jolt with them for years. He did not reach for redemption tales. He reached for accuracy, believing that truth, even told plainly, does more good than any pose. He answered letters from students who had stumbled onto his name in history projects, telling them to look at causes rather than myths, and to note how small habits order, patience. The choice to avoid boasting can shape a life for better or worse, depending on where those habits are pointed. When nights stretched long, he practiced until his hands felt warm. Old songs soaked the walls of a room far from the clubhouses and hideouts of his youth. He played slow, without flourish, the way a man breathes after climbing a long hill. Freedom at last meant grocery lists, a schedule for laundry, a neighbor's hello, and a winter coat hung neatly by a door. He kept his shoes lined up and his notebooks square on a shelf. He didn't leave maps rolled around secrets anymore. He wrote down recipes and card tricks. He let the clock move quietly and tried not to think too hard about how rare such quiet had been for most of his life. He had been labeled with a name that made school kids shiver when they read it in old papers. In person, he moved like a careful clerk. That gap between label and reality taught its own lesson. Rumor sells. Rutina endorse. He had lived long enough to understand which of those two does more to determine how a life ends. He stepped out into a morning that smelled like wet pavement and wood smoke, a city block in Montreal shrugging off the night. Freedom felt light and strange after so many years counted by whistles and keys. He carried a small bag, kept his eyes on street numbers, and studied faces the way he always had, not with suspicion, just with the habit of a man trained to notice details. Buses grumbled past. A corner diner slid open its door, heat rushing out with the scent of coffee. He paid for breakfast with bills that didn't carry a history in some evidence locker. That alone felt like a gift. He kept things modest. A rented room, a short list of stores, notes in a pocket about where to find a tailor, a library, a place to make copies. He walked rather than flagged taxis. He learned the rhythm of the neighborhood. People had their own lives to mind. Few looked twice, sensing a familiar face from an old page. Most were too busy. He approached the world as he always had. Observe. Absorb. Adapt. The difference now was purpose. He wasn't hiding. He was trying to build a small, steady life that would offend nobody. Writing began at a kitchen table with a dull pencil and a stack of cards. He outlined in the same way he once mapped a route. He listed towns, dates, names, narrow escapes, risks that turned out badly for everyone within earshot. He wanted to record what had actually happened during those years when newspapers built myths out of snapshots. A publisher liked the idea if he would work with collaborators who could shape the story into clean prose and keep the pace without leaning on melodrama. He agreed. Control mattered to him, but he could share it if that meant a clear record. He tackled the hardest parts first. Reform schools that stiffened his back rather than softened it, bank jobs executed with cold timing, kidnappings that crossed a line and drew national attention, a payroll robbery that had left a policeman dead, a city that had offered criminals quiet beds in exchange for quiet streets, a federal bureau that learned to move efficiently after its early stumbles. He stripped away swagger and filed off the shine. He didn't want any reader to walk away thinking that fear had been fun for the people on the other side of those counters, or for the families waiting by phones during ransom negotiations. He wrote about Street Paul with a clear eye. The old layover arrangement had survived because it kept gunfire off local sidewalks, but it had also created a haven that emboldened crews to grow bolder. When the kidnappings brought national heat, the deal crumbled. Officers who had once looked the other way were yanked into hearings. Names that had felt safe in back rooms turned into lines and reports. He wrote those sections with the authority of a man who had walked through them, not to settle scores, but to set the record straight. He devoted chapters to the 2 kidnappings that set him on a path to life sentences. William Ham Jr. had been seized on a sunny day, held quietly, and released when a ransom changed hands. Edward Bremer, a banker with connections that reached into the highest circles in Washington, returned home after a longer, tenser negotiation. In both cases, he argued, the victims were treated carefully to ensure safe returns. He never pretended that fact excused the crimes. He presented it to show how he had thought about risk. Keep tempers down. Keep hands steady. Get out fast. That view did not absolve him. It described him. The law saw the acts as federal felonies that demanded an answer. That answer had been decades away from ordinary life. He didn't skip the New Orleans arrest. He described cars gliding to the curb, agents stepping in close, a bureau chief nearby as witnesses clustered and stories formed. He refused to embellish. He said the boss stayed back while others closed the distance, a version that angered people who liked a cinematic finish. He held to it anyway. He didn't brag about a gun on the seat or draw breathless pictures of an almost fight that wasn't. He told a simple truth. After years of running, he was caught without a struggle on a busy street. He lived quietly between writing sessions. He filed forms as an immigrant returned to his birth country. He learned office hours, how provincial ID cards worked, which jobs were open to a man with his record. He found honest work now and then, bookbinding, repair, warehouse duties, plain tasks that went better for someone who didn't mind repetition. He kept a guitar by the window and practiced after supper. Music remained a discipline that slowed his breathing and gave shape to an evening. Letters arrived. Some came from historians who wanted a detail confirmed. Some came from students asking how a man from Montreal had ended up on wanted posters across half the continent. He answered when he had the energy, sticking to facts. He didn't compliment his younger self. He didn't judge him with theatrics either. He simply laid out the chain of choices that had led him through a maze and into a cell. He did not write much about regret. He let the record stand. The first book landed in 1971, co-written with collaborators who kept the tone spare and the timeline clean. It sold well enough to justify translation and reprints. Reviewers praised its crisp detail and its refusal to glamorize. Some grumbled that he should have expressed more remorse. He shrugged. He had done what he set out to do, put a factual account into the world to counter the myths that had grown like weeds. Reporters pushed him to go on television to debate old cases. He declined most invitations. If he couldn't be sure a program would respect victims and resist turning crime into spectacle, he stayed home. He moved west for a while, following family and warmer winters, sampling cities that offered anonymity. Vancouver welcomed him with rain, gulls, and a sky that could switch moods 10 times in an afternoon. He liked the way the harbor noise covered thought. He liked dim coffee shops with cracked leather booths and slightly crooked frames on the walls. He took long walks along avenues lined with sycamores and learned the names of side streets without looking at signs, a trick that had once served darker purposes and now served only habit. He met a few writers who wanted him to go deeper into the prison years. They were curious about daily life rather than notorious episodes. How did men keep their minds when days repeated? How did a place design silence? Who were the officers who earned trust, and who were the ones who stirred fear? He began to sketch chapters about the island and the bay, the cold structure that had held him for a quarter century. He had kept notes, even then nicknames, work rosters, small, telling details. He shaped those pages carefully to avoid glamour and to avoid giving any practical instruction. He wanted readers to understand conditions without treating them like a guide. They asked about other famous inmates. He noted that some carried smaller reputations inside than out. Machine gun. Kelly kept careful manners and went along with routine. Robert Stroud stayed apart, known to most men more through whispers than through direct contact. Al Capone arrived with a reputation that preceded him by miles, then receded as illness dulled him and his days became a series of simple tasks. He kept those portraits brief, because even at his desk he disliked gossip. The point was the institution, the design, the rhythm, not the personalities who briefly held attention. The question of Ma Barker came back constantly. especially after the Florida standoff had been dramatized in movies that favored easy roles. A mastermind mother directing sons like actors on a stage. He repeated his position. She stayed with her boys, cooked, fussed, and enjoyed domestic life when it was possible. She did not sit at a table marking routes or assigning roles. He knew that stance angered people who wanted a neat villain. He held it anyway. History, properly told, often disappoints those who want theater. He sometimes crossed paths with former lawmen at public events or in quiet rooms where researchers gathered source material. He treated them with courtesy. They had done their jobs, sometimes clumsily early on, more professionally as the 1,930 seconds rolled forward. They treated him with a wary respect born of long service. They asked direct questions. He gave direct answers. His argument with the Bureau had ended the day it booked him. He had no appetite for a late-life food. The subject of a fellow inmate from McNeil Island came up more often than he liked once a series of murders and a trial splashed that man's name across every channel. He answered each question the same way. A short, wound-up kid had wanted to be a singer. He had shown him how a chord sat on frets and how to keep time without drifting. He had refused to become a manager or an impresario. That was the end of it. He refused to inflate the link. He did not want to help turn a criminal tragedy into a showbiz anecdote. In private moments, he allowed himself a few quiet thoughts about survival. Organization had saved him in prison. Organization had gotten him this far outside. He kept a ledger for rent, food, and small expenses. He trimmed luxuries to fit within his means and avoided schemes. He signed his name patiently on the many forms a man must sign to stay in compliance after a high-profile release. He missed nobody from the violent years. The friends he remembered with affection were the ones who had left that world and stayed gone, drivers who went straight, a fixer who found honest work under another name, a clerk who had once warned him off a risky meeting. As the decade turned, he considered a warmer place for the final stretch. A coastal town in Spain offered sun, cheap rent, and the feeling of being far from the circuits that had defined him. He wouldn't be hiding from the law. He would be putting an ocean between himself and the streets, where his name still stirred old stories. He applied for the paperwork, checked the rules, and made sure that a move wouldn't violate any conditions attached to his status. He had broken every rule that mattered when he was young. He had no desire to break small ones now. He took a plane across the Atlantic, with a thin suitcase and a writer's notebooks. The air above the water smoothed out his pulse. He arrived to limestone walls, bright mornings, and a boulevard where the light seemed to linger hours longer than in Canadian winters. He rented a simple flat with a balcony just high enough to see the sea between buildings. He bought bread early each day and spent afternoons at a small desk where a breeze could move pages without flipping them. He settled into a language he didn't fully understand, a soundscape that turned him into a quiet observer again, which was the role he had always preferred. Work on the second book moved slowly and steadily. He wrote about the small mechanics of a prison day, the ritual of count, the way a workshop smelled when oil heated, how men measured progress in privileges that would mean nothing outside an extra hour with a newspaper, a different assignment that brought fresh air. He described officers who believed in structure over cruelty, and the few who enjoyed power too much. He showed how a cell could be both a cage and a refuge, depending on the dangers of a given afternoon. He did not dramatize that place any more than he had dramatized the streets. He wanted readers to see the pattern and draw lessons about systems and choices. He kept clear about the crimes that had put him there. He did not let a chapter pass without that anchor. His sentence had not been an accident, or the result of a misunderstanding. It had been the consequence of calculated acts that shook families, upended mornings, and changed the lives of people who never chose to meet him. The book would not be a cleansing. It would be a witness. The neighborhood around him warmed as summer reached its peak. Children chased balls down alleys. Radios played melodies that drifted into stairwells. He walked at dusk, tipped his cap, and kept his pace slow enough to pass for a retiree savoring air after a hot day. He had become that in a way, a man at the far end of a story that had sprinted through youth and then crawled through middle age. He found something like gratitude for the quiet he had built. Gratitude did not erase anything. It helped him breathe. In Spain, he met other expatriates who had blown across oceans in search of different lives. Painters, old sailors, former office men. a few with pasts more colorful than they let on. They gathered at cafes with wicker chairs set out on squares. He listened more than he talked, then returned home to write in the evenings. The second manuscript took shape under a steady hand. He knew he would not become rich from it. He hoped it would stand as a document people could consult when legends spread too fast. He mailed chapters to editors. He checked accounts that dribbled in from the first book. He paid rent ahead when he could. He fixed a chair when it wobbled, and tuned his guitar when humidity changed the strings. He kept a habit of writing down what he wanted from the next day on a scrap of paper at night. 3 pages on work details, a letter to a researcher, a walk to the post office, a visit to the market. He had run a life by lists when he was young. He had ruined lives with those lists. Now he used them to keep himself content and harmless in a town that barely knew his name. He watched the news when it touched on the old era. Documentaries recycled clips of him being marched between agents after the New Orleans arrest. Newscasters repeated the tie story and the argument about who had placed hands on whom. He let those debates pass. He had put his version in print. The record would outlast talk shows. He saved his energy for the sentence in front of him, the next page, the day's last cup of coffee, the breeze that would pull the curtains just a little before the street lamps came on. Heat rose off the stones by late morning, and the sea outside his window flashed like a sheet of tin. He kept a glass of water near his typewriter, and a small fan pointed at stacked pages. Spain gave him quiet. Market chatter downstairs, a radio 2 doors over that played soft melodies in the afternoon, gulls that argued at dusk. He used the stillness to finish chapters about schedules, workshops, and the exacting calm a man needs to keep his mind inside a regimented place. He had spent decades learning how institutions function. Now he described that machinery without bravado, one piece at a time. Editors wrote back with tidy notes. Could he clarify the sequence of cells he had occupied? Could he explain how counts worked during fog? Could he outline the reward system for good conduct on the island? He answered everything he could verify from memory and from his old lists. He added a section about how numbers replace names, how a file could grow heavier after a single harsh word, and how small privileges were won slowly and could be lost in a heartbeat. He put in portraits of officers who valued order and of a few who had confused discipline with cruelty. He wanted readers to see how a day could pass without incident, yet still press down like a weight. In letters to researchers, he corrected exaggerations that had hardened into folklore. He repeated that the kidnap of William Ham Jr. in 1933 had lasted only days, that the victim had been returned alive after $100,000 moved through a drop, and that everyone in the crew knew federal charges would follow if they were identified. He confirmed that the seizure of banker Edward Bremer in early 1934 had carried a larger ransom, $200,000, and a heavier cost in attention, because the Bremer family knew powerful friends in Washington who would not rest. He emphasized that both men were released alive, and that he had tried to keep tempers down during every stage. He never presented that as any kind of defense. He presented it as a detail about method in a period when methods drew lines between crews who wanted headlines and crews who wanted to stay out of the papers. Either way, the law counted both acts as serious federal crimes. So did he, looking back. He also wrote about the payroll robbery near the stockyards south of Street Paul, a jump in 1933 that turned deadly when officers answered fast. A policeman died, another was hit, and a day that had started as a timed grab ended with families shattered. He gave that moment the weight it deserved and rejected the old habit in some circles of treating violence like background noise. That job pulled eyes toward the crew long before the kidnappings lifted the chase to a national level. He knew that. He had lived with the consequences. He kept the New Orleans arrest plain. It had happened in broad daylight on Canal Street on the 1st of May 1936. Cars slid in close, agents stepped out, voices kept calm, and the run ended without a shot fired. A bureau chief stood nearby, photo ready, and press agents shaped the day into a victory that could be told simply to a country tired of roving bands. He never denied the result, only the details that made good posters. He said others moved in while the director watched. Around that moment, a rumor bloomed that the agents had been short a pair of cuffs and had to use a tie to bind his hands. He let the anecdote float without endorsing it. It told you more about the hunger for a memorable finish than about the quiet efficiency of the arrest itself. His pages about the island carried specifics that only a long-term inmate could supply. He remembered arriving in 1936, being assigned a number that would appear in files for decades 325 AZ. He remembered the dining hall's rattle at mealtime and the steady hush of the library. He wrote about learning harmonica first, then guitar, about practicing until calluses raised, and about the way music helped men keep their tempers and their sense of time in a place built to flatten both. He wrote about Machine Gun, Kelly polishing an inmate's reputation into a more courteous form, about Robert Stroud remaining a distant name to most men, about officers who could spot the difference between an honest mistake and a test of authority. He wrote about the 1,939 escape attempt that killed old partner Arthur Doc Barker, and about the 1,946 siege that shook the place and ended with a head count that felt like an inventory after a storm. He revisited Street Paul with names that scholars had started to use openly. He described how a former police chief, Tom Brown, had helped sustain an environment where outsiders could rent rooms, rest, and avoid trouble inside city lines in exchange for keeping their crimes out of town. He sketched how a local fixer with influence in clubs and back rooms had served as a conduit to both criminals and officials. He then showed how quickly that arrangement collapsed when kidnappings spurred federal attention, how Brown lost his post, how hearings pulled a curtain back on a system many residents had only suspected. He described it not to settle scores, but to help readers understand how the crew had moved through that time and why the terrain shifted underfoot as headlines stacked up. He also addressed persistent myths about a mother who had traveled with her sons. He repeated what he had said often. She had kept house, packed lunches, and enjoyed being with her boys when they were free. She had not drawn diagrams, assigned roles, or chosen targets. He knew the claim of a criminal matriarch sold tickets and magazines. He stuck to the facts he knew because he had been there. The Florida standoff in 1935 that ended with bodies carried from a lakeside house had been decisive in closing a chapter. He wrote about that day in the same measured voice he used for everything else. Hours of tense shouting, walls splintered by gunfire, silence at the end, and a community that never forgot the noise. His Spanish days fell into a rhythm that kept him healthy. He rose early, did light exercises, walked to a bakery, and greeted the same faces. He kept himself invisible by being consistent. If someone recognized him from an old clipping, they usually did not say it aloud. People in that town had their own lives. He practiced music after lunch, wrote for several hours, and answered a short stack of letters before supper. He allowed himself a glass of wine with dinner, nothing more. He had seen too many men unsteady on their feet for too many years to make a habit of dulling his senses. Friends from Canada sent updates. A writer who had helped shape the first book mailed a clipping from a newspaper that had run a retrospective on the 1,930 seconds, complete with familiar photos. He read the article with the same cool attention he brought to everything. He underlined a date that was off by a week and circled a quote that had been attributed to him but came from someone else. Errors didn't surprise him. That was why he wrote. Each book set a pin on the map, a fixed point that people could use when the stories started to blur. He offered a bit of room for the notion of luck when he talked about the years on the run. He had survived long enough to be captured alive because he kept calm, planned carefully, and adjusted fast. He had also been lucky when a passerby looked the other way, lucky when a stoplight changed at the right second, lucky when an officer questioning a boarding house guest decided to return the next morning instead of that night. In prison, he had been lucky to stay healthy. He told young interviewers that any life built on that much chance will collapse sooner or later. The only steady thing he had ever found was routine. His second manuscript grew into a full account of routines so detailed that people who had never seen a prison would be able to picture the pace without imagining that the place had been either a medieval dungeon or a hotel with bars. He described the industry of the workshops, furniture repair, cloth cutting, machine maintenance, and the way the place tried to keep men useful. He didn't romanticize the system. He noted the boredom, the tensions that flared over nothing, the way isolation could erode a person who lacked structure. He also pointed out that clear rules and fair enforcement helped more than noise and spectacle. He believed that small fairnesses, the kind a guard can offer, by explaining a decision instead of barking it, made a measurable difference in keeping days from boiling over. He folded into those pages shorter sketches of his early years to keep the arc intact. He wrote that he started with petty theft and car stealing, learned bigger tricks in reformatories and prisons, and moved step by step into bank jobs with stolen cars and switched plates, then into kidnappings that crossed the federal line. He tallied the places where the crew had acted. Minnesota towns with 2 stoplight squares, small cities in Iowa and Kansas, larger targets when they had better maps. He did not run through a trophy list. He simply made sure the record was comprehensive. He mentioned how marks on ransom bills had narrowed the field as the currency moved, how phone calls had been traced by methodical men listening through switchboards, how informers had emerged as nerves frayed. He noted that a shady surgeon who promised new faces a man whispered about among gangs had vanished under murky circumstances, not long after patching up clients. Life on that edge consumed its own. He took care not to offer operational details that could teach someone how to do harm. The past was the past. He would not make it a manual. He drew lines between description and instruction and stuck on the safe side. Editors appreciated that. They had told him the same. A record, not a recipe. Neighbors grew used to him as a polite foreigner who kept odd hours and always returned a borrowed cup. He learned simple Spanish phrases with care, asking a storekeeper to correct him when he stumbled. He found a tailor who could fix an old jacket and a cobbler who could coax life from shoes that would have been tossed in a richer household. He liked those shops because they were honest about wear and repair. He had once spent his days wearing out people's nerves. Now he tried to do the opposite. From time to time, journalists arrived with lists of questions about others from that era. Dillinger's last hours outside the theater, the Wisconsin lodge where a raid went sideways, an outlaw whose short temper had set everything around him on fire. He answered with as much restraint as the questions allowed. He had crossed paths with some of those figures, traded information with others, and simply heard about many through the grapevine. He refused to turn the dead into players in a sideshow. He repeated 2 themes. The street. Paul arrangement had substituted quiet at home for violence in the streets for a time, and the Federal Bureau had grown more capable and professional under pressure, moving from stumbles to steadier methods as 1,934 turned to 1,935 and beyond. Both facts mattered to understanding how his own story had unfolded. Letters also asked about the young inmate who had craved a career in music and who, years later, became infamous for orchestrating crimes that shook the country. He answered briefly. The kid had wanted lessons. He had given him a few. He had urged practice. He had refused to introduce him to anyone of influence. The kid had been more interested in attention than work. He left it there. Names and details belonged to another case, another ledger. He would not contribute to a celebrity glare on the worst parts of human behavior. The seasons in Spain softened him. He liked winter sunlight on white walls, and the way cafe owners knew his order. He kept to his budgets, sent chapters by mail, checked proofs on his balcony, and took pride in catching typos. He put aside a small amount for emergencies, knowing how quickly life can surprise a man. He fixed a wobbly table with shims from a wine cork and smiled when it held. He had once handled barrels and guns with the same calm hands. He preferred screws and glue. He thought about restitution. There was no way to return what had been taken. The calm of people forced to look down the barrel of a weapon. The years stolen from families who had mourned or waited. The dignity displaced by fear in a lobby while a robbery unfolded. All he could do was refuse to feed myths and refuse to treat crime like a sport. He replied to students who seemed eager to glamorize the 1,930 seconds by recommending books on the economics of the Depression and on Prohibition's effect on neighborhoods. He told them to study how law, corruption, and hardship combined to create an environment where crews could thrive briefly, and how those same forces mutated into a national response that shut that era down. He noticed his health, the way he noticed everything else, by tracking patterns. Sleep came easier on days he walked farther. Hands stayed limber. If he played through scales each morning, he kept appointments, took recommended tests, and treated doctors with the same quiet respect he had once reserved for the few officers who dealt straight with inmates. He wrote down any instruction he received and followed it. He had spent half a lifetime defying rules. He was tired of that. A friend brought him a newspaper from Canada with a feature on how the old kidnappings had driven legal changes, including clearer federal powers to pursue cases across state lines and harsher penalties for ransom crimes. He nodded at that. It matched his memory. He had seen the federal apparatus build speed as the decade advanced. The difference between 1931 and 1936 was dramatic. Better communication, faster radios, more experienced agents, shared files, and a country less willing to tolerate local arrangements that had once kept the lid on in a single city. He had met that change head-on and lost. He accepted that the story would be told as both a crime narrative and as a chapter in the history of law enforcement's growth. When the second book neared completion, he wrote a foreword that read like a compact ledger. He noted that his account would stick to fact, that it would not reach for sympathy, and that it would correct the myths that had cropped up in the years after he was taken into custody. He thanked the officers who had allowed him books and instruments when he had earned them. He acknowledged the editors who had trimmed his plain sentences into cleaner lines without changing their meaning. He made one request, written softly, that anyone who read his account remember that behind headlines sit clerks, tellers, drivers, and families whose days never returned to normal after contact with people like him. He mailed the final version knowing that publication would lag. He had patience to spare. His life had trained him to move through time like a man counting steps on a long road. He had once counted those steps toward a getaway car. Now he counted them toward a manila envelope with galley pages marked in blue pencil. He had rewritten his part in the manila envelope, story as a factual record rather than a boast. What came after that felt out of his hands. He had learned, slowly, to accept that some things must be handed over to others, judges, guards, editors, or readers, and that control has limits. He spent evenings on the balcony watching the street settle. He liked the way a neighbor watered plants just before dark. He liked the orange glow from a cafe sign that hummed faintly once the sun dropped. He ran fingers over strings until notes fit under his skin. He had no desire to return to the places where he had once moved in whispers and panic. He had no nostalgia for a time that people still dressed up as excitement. He wanted what he had, a clean room, an honest routine, a few pages to correct, a walk to the post office, and a morning that began with the sound of a broom on stone. Sun pressed through the balcony door and laid a bright strip across his desk. He turned pages with a slow hand, checking dates, trimming a sentence here and there, making sure that what he set down matched memory and record. He had no patience left for flourish. He wanted a clear account that would stand even if no one liked the way it sounded. The past would not change just because a writer rounded an edge. He adjusted his chair, took a sip of water, and returned to a section about the day-to-day pressure that settles on a man when every door is locked from the outside. Mail slid under his door around noon. In it sat a letter from a graduate student in Minnesota. The questions were sharp and respectful. Could he outline the crew's sequence of jobs before the kidnappings? He wrote back that the early run had leaned on stolen cars, switched plates, and quick exits. Banks in small, busy towns were chosen for weak alarms and short response times. The crew hit places in Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Arkansas, then looped back to hideouts in cities that tolerated out-of-towners as long as trouble stayed outside the lines. Cash went into envelopes, engines cooled in barns and alleys. He explained that he favored speed over show, and that he rarely stuck to the same kind of target twice in a row. He also told the student what the papers often skipped. Clerks and guards walked away shaking and sleepless. They had done nothing to invite that fear. He set down a plain list of events that had drawn the most heat even before the ransom cases. A payroll grab near the stockyards south of Street Paul in 1933 turned bloody when officers reached the scene fast. One man in uniform died, another was badly hurt, and the sound of gunfire hung over the streets long after the cars had fled. That loss widened the circle of people who wanted him found, and it pushed the crew closer to the edge where kidnappings begin to look, to desperate men, like a way to make a big score without entering a bank lobby. He did not soften his telling. He kept the focus on cause and effect. He included, for the record, how the ham grab was done in Street Paul in 1933. The seizure took place in daylight. The movement kept quiet. The family paid $100,000, and the man went home alive. In early 1934, the Bremer case brought far more danger because the target's family had friends who could summon the fullest force of the federal government. That ransom was $200,000, and the moment those bills began to circulate, the hunt for serial numbers stitched together leads from drugstores, gas stations, and banks. He had made choices that crossed a line no plea could erase. He would not pretend otherwise. He also straightened out a piece of lore that had taken on a life of its own. During his time on the run, he had sought help from a former surgeon who worked off the books. The man had built a reputation among crooks for changing faces just enough to slow recognition. The work was crude. It left scars and did not perform miracles. The surgeon later disappeared and was presumed dead under suspicious circumstances. Rumor credited that to him. He wrote, as he had always said, that he had not done it, and that life in that world had a way of consuming the very people who tried to live between lines. He accepted that some would never believe him, but he would not add color to a story just to satisfy a listener's appetite. After a few slow months, the second book finally went into proof. He marked corrections in pencil on the balcony while the afternoon wind turned hot. He clarified his arrival in 1936 to the island in the bay, where his number 325 AZ would follow him through every chore and count. He included the sound of trays in the dining hall, the quiet rules of the library, the years of practice that turned a harmonica into a lifeline before a guitar took its place. He noted the calm, even courtly manner of a one-time headline maker named Kelly, the distance that separated most men from a famous inmate known for birds, the way officers could cool a tear by explaining a decision instead of barking it. He recorded the January night when Doc Barker died during a fog-bound escape try, and the May siege years later that rattled windows and reinforced the lesson that explosions rarely buy freedom. He allowed editors to polish grammar without touching meaning. He asked them to keep his refusal to glamorize intact. The book was meant to show how hours pass behind walls, how men manage time, how rules can hold people together or break them apart, and how a life built on bad choices ends in a place where a person measures progress in privileges that would sound small to anyone outside. He insisted on reminding readers that the sentence had been earned by acts that startled and hurt people who had simply gone to work one morning. When he put his pen down at last and walked to the market, he felt a lightness that had nothing to do with fame. It felt like finishing a job properly. The shopkeeper bagged bread and olives and asked about the heat. He answered in halting Spanish and made the man laugh. He had spent half a lifetime reading faces to gauge danger. Now he read the same faces for signs of daily life. Worry about prices, amusement at a street performer's tricks, concern when the neighbor upstairs did not open her shutters by noon. He preferred this kind of attention. Questions still found him. Journalists wanted a ranking of outlaws. He refused. That was the game of people who enjoyed posters. He knew too well what lay behind them. Long stretches of quiet fear, tense minutes that could erupt into tragedy, and, for the crew he had led, an end that came with cells and funerals. He would list facts. He would not play a contest. He made clear that civil corruption in one city had been the hinge on which much of his early survival swung. While certain officials held power, outsiders who brought money into town and kept their guns holstered inside the city could rent apartments, take meals, and rest without constant raids. Once kidnappings shined a national light on that arrangement, the fix fell apart. A police chief lost his job. Files that had been whispered about were opened. The change forced his crew into the open, and each new hiding place carried the risk of a bad neighbor or a landlord with a better memory than expected. He had learned to adapt, but even the best routines wore thin under that kind of pressure. He kept describing his arrest in New Orleans the same way each time, because he understood how stories inflate. Cars rolled to a stop. Agents stepped forward. A director stood nearby. No shots, no daring dash, no last stand. Just the end of a chase that had swallowed years. Later, officials called him Public Enemy Number 1 to close a chapter on the era of roaming crews. He had never asked for that label. He could see why it worked for the Bureau's story. It provided a clean ending the public could understand. As he grew more settled in Spain, he allowed himself a broader view of the decades. Prohibition had flooded the country with illegal money and violent competition. And when the law rolled back that spur, the hard years of the Depression still left people without work. That mix had created fertile ground for thieves who preferred long planning to sudden rage. He had used that ground and helped till it further, by moving money along routes that kept men like him afloat. By the mid-1930s, the federal response had caught up. Radios linked cars. Teletype tied offices. The Bureau learned to build cases over time instead of chasing headlines one by one. He lived at the point where those lines met, and he lost the long game. He took care to answer one persistent question that arrived every season. Did he feel remorse? He replied that he felt the absence of the people who had crossed his path unwillingly. He felt the weight of a dead officer's name and knew that a uniform folded at a funeral had been heavier than any bag of money he had ever carried. He said he did not believe in gestures. He believed in accuracy. He had been as accurate as he knew how to be about each stage of his story. Whether that counted as remorse was for others to decide. Expatriates drifted through his days with stories of their own. A painter spoke about a storm that had wrecked his studio in another country. A former sailor told him how coastal lights look from a freighter at 3 in the morning. A retired teacher traded recipes for stews that made cheap cuts taste rich. He found pleasure in these small exchanges and kept his contributions modest. If he mentioned anything from the past, it was a single line about a town's smell at dawn, or the way a map folds along lines that were pressed years ago and never really disappear. He did not ignore the loose ends in the official narrative. He noted that his old partner Lloyd, who had not been part of the big kidnappings, had left the hard road only to die years later in a domestic tragedy that played out far from any bank. He touched on how men in that world often carried their troubles into whatever life came next. That was not an excuse for anything. It was an observation about the inertia of habit and the drag of a past that would not let go. Money never grew plentiful. Royalties paid bills. They did not make him rich. He kept expenses low and allowed himself sensible comforts. He cooked, walked, practiced, and read. He watched a soccer match once in a while and smiled at the joy that rolled through a neighborhood when the home side won. He had lived long enough to welcome joy on any street for any reason that did not require somebody else to suffer. Editors asked him to expand the short section where he talked about mentors and students behind walls. He wrote that he had learned chess from a quiet man who said nothing during games and taught by moving a piece, then raising an eyebrow until the lesson landed. He wrote that he had passed along guitar chords to young inmates because music steadied hands and cleared minds. He wrote that one of those youngsters craved attention more than practice, and later went on to direct acts that horrified a nation. He had refused even then to become a promoter. He did not want his name tied to that person in any way beyond the harmless truth that he had shown a kid where to put fingers on frets. He left it there. He also revisited his dealings with physicians in hiding. He made a point of saying that medicine without rules becomes a dangerous trade. He had been lucky to survive crude work that criminals hoped would make them harder to recognize. He listed the reasons it rarely did. Heights and gaits do not change, patterns are hard to mask, and faces live in the memory in ways scars cannot erase. He added that any attempt to erase fingerprints, a trick some crooks believed in, damaged hands, and did not defeat modern files. Even as a former outlaw, he urged readers to drop the superstition. Sometimes he walked along the promenade at sunset and traced the line of his life on the horizon in his mind. Born in Montreal, moved through the Midwest, trained by hard places in silence and patience, stepped into bank lobbies and out again, crossed into kidnappings that woke a nation, ran until a street in New Orleans ended the run, learned to live by rules in a prison built to crush will, found a small corner of calm in routine and music, crossed back to Canada, then crossed an ocean to right where the breeze could push a curtain. The arc was not elegant. It was what it was. He received a letter from a retired agent who had worked cases in the 30s. The man's tone was professional and unadorned. He praised the fairness of the first book's recounting of federal improvements and wrote that, in the long view, both sides had grown up at the same time, criminal crews becoming more organized, while the law learned to coordinate. He said it was odd to place his own life and Karpis's on a single timeline, but that it helped him understand why so many familiar names had ended in files or graves between 1933 and 1936. Karpis replied with equal simplicity and wished the man a quiet retirement. As summer leaned toward autumn, he felt his body remind him of time. He adjusted how far he walked and when. He kept doctor's appointments, wrote down instructions, and followed them. He had known men who ignored counsel because listening made them feel small. He had been made small by iron bars and keys long ago. A physician's advice did not reduce him. It kept him moving. He thought often about the people of Street Paul. That city had carried a double life for years, one visible and respectable, the other conducted in low rooms with hushed voices. The collapse of that arrangement had changed not only his path but the city's. He hoped residents found some use in knowing what had happened and why, even if they hated seeing the old shame laid out. He believed that sunlight, used carefully, cleans a record more than it burns it. He kept track of the calendar not for parole boards anymore, but for publication schedules. The second book would come out after a slow, careful editing process, and he had set himself to be ready for small events where he might sign copies and answer questions, as long as the conversations held to history and did not sink into theater. He practiced trimming answers to respect time and attention. He would not talk past the shape of a question. He had once valued control above everything. Now, he valued clarity. On certain nights, he laid the guitar across his lap without playing and sat listening to the neighborhood. A door closed 3 floors up. A bus hissed to a stop. Someone on the corner tossed a joke to a friend, and both laughed. He let those sounds remind him that most lives hum along without drama. His had hummed like that too once in a while, and might have more often if he had chosen differently at each early fork. There was no way to rerun the path. There was a way to keep step with the present. He wrote in his notebook that he had spent years chasing a feeling of control, and had finally learned that steady routines give more of it than cash ever did. He wrote that he had once believed in perfect plans, and had watched them buckle when a stranger turned left instead of right. He wrote that the best he could do for anyone now was to set down a record that did not lie and to answer letters with care. He folded the paper and slipped it into a drawer with other small truths. The tide tapped against the seawall as if agreeing. He turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. Morning drifted in through thin curtains like a quiet tide. He opened a package on his desk and found the first finished copy of the new book. The cover looked spare, the way he wanted it. He turned it over in his hands, checked the index, ran a finger along a paragraph he had fussed over for weeks, then set it upright against a glass of water, as if to remind himself the work existed outside his head. Years earlier, he had measured life in maps and schedules. Now he measured it in pages corrected, letters answered, small dinners cooked, a walk made before the sun got too hot. A postcard from Minnesota waited underneath the parcel. A reader who had grown up hearing about the old Street Paul arrangement wrote that the book had helped lay out how it worked and why it failed. The note came without accusation or praise, just relief at a clearer picture. He appreciated that tone. He was done with verdicts in bright ink. He answered with the same steadiness. The arrangement had allowed outsiders to lie low, as long as they respected city limits. Kidnapping destroyed that quiet because it reached into families' homes and brought Washington's gaze. Once the glare landed, officials tumbled and safe rooms vanished. He still received questions about those spring days of 1933 and 1934. He explained again how the crew selected targets. Banks where alarms lagged and police stations sat far from the doors that mattered. Small towns in Iowa and Arkansas. Larger ones only after maps improved. Car thefts came first because reliable escape mattered more than anything. Plates were swapped fast. Drivers stuck to back roads. He noted that the payroll job near the stockyards outside Street, Paul turned a corner nobody could turn back from, that a policeman lost his life, that families were changed forever, and that the robbery's aftermath made kidnapping seem, to men thinking only of risk and money, like a way to avoid walking into a lobby. He understood now that he had only moved from one kind of harm into another. He wrote again for the record that William Ham Jr. had been seized in 1933 and released within days after $100,000 moved through a drop, and that early 1934 brought the Bremer case with a bigger ransom and far more peril, because it drew power from the capital into the chase. Serial numbers stitched a quilt of leads as currency passed through stores and banks. He had built plans without slack. The law had built patience. That combination erased his margin. Local journalists asked him to sit for short interviews once the book shipped. He said yes when the setting promised a calm exchange. He said no when a program looked eager to turn old crimes into an evening's thrill. He spoke plainly about how the Bureau's methods had matured, how radios, teletype, and shared files turned a patchwork of local efforts into something closer to a national net, and how his own discipline, which had once felt like an advantage, had begun to show patterns that better investigators learned to read. He never took credit for daring. He took responsibility for planning. That had defined him. It had also led him to a door on Canal Street, where he stood still, and let hands close on his wrists. He walked each afternoon along streets that smelled like warm stone and sea salt. A baker waved. A child kicked a ball against a low wall and chased it into a patch of shadow. He didn't hurry. He had rushed enough in his life. In the evenings, he worked through scales, then played songs he had learned in a cell. Music ran like a line back through the hard years, not to glorify them, but to show that something steady could exist in places designed to erase it. Readers sent notes that could not be taken lightly. A bank clerk from long ago wrote in careful script about a morning that had begun normally and ended with fear that left traces for years. The letter did not accuse. It described tremors that returned without warning. He wrote back to say that he had spent decades thinking about people like her, that nothing he could do or say would restore what had been taken, and that the best he could offer was accuracy and the refusal to make entertainment out of pain. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not claim it. He kept the letter in a drawer by his desk. Some who approached him wanted rankings, the old magazine trick that stacks names like headlines at a newsstand. He declined every time. If he spoke of other outlaws, he did so to ground the record. Dillinger's last days in Chicago had followed a string of mistakes and pressures nobody counted on. A lodge in Wisconsin became a trap because nobody checked a simple assumption. A hot-headed gunman burned every bridge he walked across. He named what he knew, then stopped. He would not inflate stories or reduce any of them to a list. He addressed myths in the same even voice. He reiterated that a mother's presence had been domestic, not strategic. He acknowledged that people prefer clean villains. He preferred truth, messy or dull as it might be in comparison. He restated that a doctor who promised surgical shortcuts to anonymity had not been murdered at his order, that the man had disappeared in a world that often swallows its fringe characters, and that scars do not defeat recognition the way desperate people hope they will. He even set down a small section debunking tricks with fingerprints that only injured hands without confusing modern files. An editor in Canada proposed a small tour to coincide with the new book's release. A handful of library talks. A couple of interviews conducted by sober hosts. Nothing flashy. He agreed with conditions. No stage pieces, no reenactments, no stunts that would drag fear back into rooms where it had no business. He wanted to meet readers who were curious about institutions, choices, and consequences. The trip felt strange. Airports had changed. The crowds, the lights, the flow of speech in two languages, he moved through it on automatic, kept his bag within reach, and made eye contact only when necessary. At the stops, he told the same story he had written. A boy learned silence. A young man learned planning. A crew capitalized on corruption and slow communication. A line was crossed with kidnappings. A hunt grew stronger. An arrest happened without drama. Decades were served with discipline. A small, quiet life became the goal. Questions returned to details from the island where he had spent so many years. Was it true he was the longest-serving inmate there? He said that by most accounts he had spent more time on that rock than any other man, arriving in 1936 and leaving only when the system decided to move him after more than 2 decades. He described the sound of a count being called the relief of a fair decision after a stretch of petty rulings, the way a library card could feel like a lifeline, and the corrosive effect of officers who mistook volume for authority. He did not excuse the place. He did not demonize it. He drew it plainly. He flew back to Spain after a week of travel with relief, slept late once, then slid back into routine as if it were a jacket hung on a peg. Letters dwindled to a reasonable trickle. Royalty checks arrived in sums that paid rent and groceries with a bit left to save. He fixed a burner that sputtered and replaced a gasket in a leaky tap. He had hands that had once held maps and weapons. Now they turned bolts and plucked strings. Age settled in gently at first. He adjusted his pace on stairs and kept a hand on the rail. He wrote down a doctor's advice on a folded card and tucked it into a wallet. He kept appointments and returned with receipts. He had spent the first half of life ignoring rules until they were forced on him. He spent the end of life following small rules that kept him upright. When neighbors asked how he had learned such patience, he smiled without explaining that impatience had cost him a continent. He remained consistent when asked about remorse. He said he felt the absence of people who had gone to work and found themselves in danger because he wanted money. He said he felt the weight of a funeral held for a man in uniform after the stockyards robbery. He did not believe that a new tone or a public display could balance survivors' years. He believed only that a truthful account helps keep myths from burying facts, and that honest memory recorded without spin serves those who try to understand how a city, a crew, and a country met in one brief, violent chapter. The arguments about his arrest never fully went away. One camp pictured a director lunging like a character from a serial. He kept to his version. The boss stayed back, agents did the hands-on work, and a tie may or may not have been used for a moment because the rush of the move outpaced the tools at hand. He could see why people liked the other tale. It made a photo into a story. He had learned to distrust that impulse. A clear, quiet record endures longer than a poster. He heard that old files continued to open in the States, that researchers pored over memos that had once sat behind heavy doors. His name wove through them with a long paper trail attached. He took no pleasure in that. He took some satisfaction in knowing that his own pages gave context to those documents, that readers could cross-check and calibrate, instead of taking any single voice as gospel. He thought often about lessons the era might hold. Hard times had made the country brittle. Bad money had made neighborhoods meaner. Crooked deals had shielded outsiders in the short term, and harmed communities in the long term. He had exploited all of that. Then, under pressure, the nation built a better response. He had lived at that hinge. He wanted students to weigh those forces more than they weighed any single figure's bravado. He wrote that in a letter to a teacher who planned a unit on crime in the 1,930 seconds, and he suggested reading lists that included not only memoirs and case files but also city histories and studies of prohibition. Late in the decade, he took shorter walks, made lighter meals, and wrote fewer pages each day. He still practiced music in the morning. He still straightened a stack of letters before setting the first one down to answer. He still cut sentences until they read clean. He still kept shoes lined up by the door and a coat brushed. He did not chase bustle. He kept close to the few streets where he knew the faces. One afternoon he sat with a cup on the balcony and watched the sky turn the color of pale brass. He thought about friends who had not lived long enough to reach a quiet chair. He thought about a clinic corner where a doctor had lied to patients and to himself about what surgery could do. He thought about the man who had taught him chess with silence and raised eyebrows. He thought about a grocery clerk who had sent a note describing a tremor decades after the morning she had faced him across a counter. He felt the same answer rise again. There was no theater left to perform. Only the record remained. In the spring of 1979, he finished a short afterword for a later edition, a page and a half that thanked readers for holding the story steady and reminded them, once more, that economic and political currents shaped the years more than any single name. He mailed it and walked home past a row of cypress trees, with their roots pushing up the pavement. Neighbors nodded. He nodded back. Before summer peaked, he died in the small apartment he had kept neat, far from the streets where his name once passed from mouth to mouth. Authorities reported no foul play. Friends handled arrangements quietly. Family received word and took care of what needed doing away from reporters and bright lights. Debate about the exact manner of his passing flickered in some corners, but the official account stood. He had left few burdens behind beyond papers, instruments, and a shelf of marked books. The second book reached stores after he was gone, bearing his voice across its pages spare, careful, precise. Readers who had followed the first account turned to it for a view inside the institution that had held him for so long. Scholars quoted it when talking about discipline, boredom, and the value of fair rules in closed systems. Others read it to understand how a man who had once thrived on movement had adapted to a life where every door closed on its own. He could not accept praise for that. He had adapted because he had to. He had done wrong and lived with the result. His place in memory settled into a strange niche. He had been the last of the major Depression-era public enemies to be taken alive. He had served longer on Alcatraz than anyone else, by most counts. He had written narratives that refused glamour and insisted on the weight of cause and effect. He had contradicted the legend of a mastermind mother and explained how a city's quiet deal with criminals had ended under scrutiny. He had described kidnappings and robberies as they were, calculated harms that left ripples long after the cash was spent. He had left music as proof that a human being can shape a small corner into calm, even when larger choices have gone wrong. Students kept writing to ask what they should learn from him. The answer sat between his lines. Patience can be a tool for harm or for order. Discipline without empathy breeds cold acts. Systems matter. Myths grow when records are muddy, and nothing in that old era looks heroic when seen from the bank floor or a family kitchen. He wanted those points to live longer than any tale about a daring escape that never happened, or a movie scene that made an arrest prettier than it had been. He had written to fix a foundation under memory. In the end, his story reads like a long ledger. On one side sit robberies, a payroll job that brought a fatal loss, 2 kidnappings that shook families and laws, years on the run, the arrest that ended it, then a long, orderly stretch inside walls that were famous for holding tough men steady. On the other side sit notes, songs, letters, work done well, pages that kept details clear, and a quiet late life he built with care in a country that had not been his home since childhood. The balance never evens. It cannot. The closest he came to settling accounts was honesty. If you listen for him now, you won't find a shout. You might find a careful voice on a page describing how a guard's fairness made a tier easier to live on, or how a city's backroom promises sowed its own downfall, or how a pistol held in a lobby can keep ringing in a clerk's ears for decades. You might hear a guitar from a balcony as evening crowds wander past a cafe sign that hums. The sea keeps its own counsel. The street below carries on. A man who once depended on speed and silence learned, finally, to let both slow. That is where his life leaves you. With a clear view of what happened, a steady breath, and the soft closing of a door that opens into an ordinary night. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Alvin Karpis here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through strategy, patience, and the life of a man who always stayed one step ahead. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.